Good morning. I wish to thank you in particular, Professor Bessie Dendrino, for inviting me to this beautiful conference that I wish I were with you. I could participate in person, but I'm trying to give my contribution to your 2 days work, 2 days conference from sunny Toronto today. I will organize, I'm talking about, as you know from the title, Mediation for Plurilingual Competence, Synergies and Implication, and I'm going to organize my talk around the 4 points. First, I will very briefly provide some information about some conceptual talking and information about mediation as a concept. Then I will move to the work that has been done recently for the publication of the new CFR companion volume, seeing how mediation was taken into consideration and how it was pivotal in the development of this new tool. We will move then to mediation and plurilingualism, trying to explore in a greater depth of plurilingualism and see how the two concepts of mediation and plurilingualism are linked in a dynamic view. And finally, some conclusions about how these two concepts help us making the invisible visible, and therefore discussing a bit their implication for a new vision in language education. So let's start with the concept of mediation. Well, mediation, as you know, is a concept that is not only in education. It has been studied in different domains. Lenoir, a colleague here from Canada, defines it a nomadic notion as a kind of all-embracing nomadic notion. In fact, it has been the object of study very often in diplomacy, conflict resolution, and even in the commercial domain with this idea of arbitration, counseling, and guidance. It has been a core concept studies in philosophy, moving from Hegel, who defined mediation as the abstract operation through which knowledge is acquired, further including a social component with the works of Marx and Engels, who said that it's a form of relation between opposing domains and forces in society. And with a big move towards psychology and education done by Vygotsky, who sees for whom social interaction and mediation have a fundamental role in the development of cognition. In language and culture, which is the domain we are more interested in, staying with Vygotsky's theory, mediation is core because it refers to the interdependence of individual and collective, of the cognitive and the social, of intrapersonal and interpersonal, with the idea that higher mental functions are always mediated by psychological and cultural tools. And this tool, especially language being probably the main tool. But it's also this idea of mediation is in this idea of a dynamic process of meaning making through languaging, as Swain reminds us, and plurilanguaging, which means languaging with different languages and different elements, as I will explain further in my talk, which happens and is done both individually and socially, at the individual level and the social level. But the cultural aspect of mediation is, of course, not to be neglected. Culture approaches mediation is a cultural process of creating a shared space, a shared and safe third space, or what Gramsci later reformulated into and expanded into symbolic competence, and acting in a plural area to bring people together and recognize and negotiate their differences, as Zarat indicates in her definition of intercultural mediation. So basically, mediation is crucial. It's crucial to meaning making because it helps us to reconceptualize language. And through mediation, we can reconceptualize language as an activity. We can reconceptualize it as an emergent dynamic process of shared meaning, which creates and transforms itself through interactions of individuals with their environment. We can reconceptualize language as a complex dynamic system and as a socialization into communities of practice. And finally, we can reconceptualize language as a process that allows overcoming separation between individuals and the culture and the society. So all these concepts, all these views of mediation were core to inform our work at the Council of Europe in a 4-year project that started in 2013, then 14 particularly for mediation, and brought to the publication of the companion volume. In this next step, I'm referring to that work to try and go deeper into why mediation is helping us to broaden and deepen the perspective that we have of language education by completing the CFR descriptive scheme, as we will see in a moment. So if we consider the CFR descriptive scheme, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, is organized around this descriptive scheme that shows how language proficiency is definitely not a linear, but a very dynamic and composite process that embeds different types of competencies, that is visible through communicative language activities, as you see in this column, and externalizes, is conducted through strategies, and touches both linguistic and general competencies. Now, as you can see, this is the general descriptive scheme of the CFR, which was already there in 2001 with mediation, but mediation was kind of just announced and not developed. Precisely developing, deeply conceptualizing mediation and seeing what's its potential for language education has been at the core of the project for the new companion volume. As I said, the CFR already announced or introduced rather many important new perspectives and new aspects, and I listed them here on the left column, where we talk about curriculum alignment, where assessment and curriculum are linked and pedagogy are totally linked and coherent. It moves away from the 4 skills to the 4 modes of communication, one of which is mediation. There is a co-construction of meaning in interaction, and learner are started to see a social agent, and introduces the action-oriented approach, and it introduces also plurilingual and pluricultural competencies. So if that was already there, why did we need a companion volume? Well, precisely because some concepts needed to be updated and completed and broadened, and particularly the work that the companion volume did was to broaden the CFR concept of mediation and to develop the construct, among which one of the most important was the pluri. By doing that, the idea is to really flesh out what the learner as a social agent, or acteur social as you say in French, is. So as every time when somebody do something starting from an existing document, you start from what you have. Well, the notion of mediation announced in the CFR 2001 was not very deep yet, because we had this idea that the language user is not expressing their own meanings, but they simply act as an intermediary between interlocutors that cannot understand each other. However, there was also another point where it says, well, mediation language activities or processing and reprocessing an existing text occupy an important part of our life. And there was a scheme that was no longer, unfortunately, in the CFR 2001, but it was in a previous version online, that showed how interaction already is linked or brings together reception and production, is relevant to both and has a bit of both. And mediation has incorporates basically all three modes of communication and goes beyond. This was our starting point, but there was definitely a call for a more complex conceptualization, because through mediation, as we saw, such an important concept, language serves different purposes. Through mediation, we can create a pluricultural space for communication and learning. We can reduce affective blocks, we can reduce tension, building bridges towards the new, the other, constructing and co-constructing new meaning, passing on information, and it's the processing and reprocessing of text, like simplifying, elaborating, illustrating, or adapting, and definitely acting as an intermediary. So you see that on top of the two last in the list that were already there were many more deep, important aspects and concepts that we needed to care for. In this process of trying to tackle these deep concepts, we developed a model, a conceptual model, where we kind of managed to show the nature of the double nature of mediation as a cognitive and a relational concept and activity, where cognitive and relational are not separate but are embedded one into the other. And the idea that within this cognitive and relational, we do not have to forget that the emotional part is always there. So the three aspects are somehow embedded one in the other. However, there's not only this part, let's say, mediation in the broader view, but we needed to also find a way of connecting our work to what we were developing, that was updating and broadening the scope even of the CFR by developing plurilingual and pluricultural dimension, by updating and taking into consideration online communication, and also by responding to something that is very used in the language classroom, which is a dialogue with literature. So if we look at these 3 points, we see that these are also forms of mediation, because plurilingual and pluricultural goes across languages and cultures, but remains in this idea of cognitive and relational and emotional. And the same we can say for online communication across media and literature, which is a kind of mediation across words as well. I won't talk about online and literature today, but we will say more about the plurilingual and pluricultural. So, going from this theoretical model or conceptual model to practice was yet another challenge. What forms of mediation could we identify that could inform some descriptors and some way of bringing this deep and kind of challenging concept into the class? Well, looking at all the studies that I presented in point 1 and our conceptual model, we kind of chunked down this idea of mediation into four main domains: linguistic mediation and textual, where it focuses on both the interlinguistic dimension and the intralinguistic dimension; the cultural mediation, which focuses on facilitating understanding, cultural awareness, and again, it can be within a language or across languages and cultures; social mediation, which includes media, of course, where one plays the role of intermediary, linguistic and cultural mediator, but also develops a kind of critical cultural awareness; and finally, what is probably better known, more familiar to educators, the pedagogic mediation, where educators mediate knowledge, mediate concepts, and mediate thinking. And they do it both cognitively and relationally, as we will see in a moment. So all these types of mediation, again, we had to boil them down into categories that would inform the descriptors that we produced. And we fused this interpretation into the idea that we mediate communication, we mediate concepts, and we mediate text. In mediating communication, we create a space, we manage tension, counseling, conflict resolution, and guidance. You see, it's linked to what we said, one of the aspects of the studies of mediation. We mediate concepts by constructing and co-constructing meaning and knowledge together, which goes with hand in hand with this idea that we involve both the social dimension and the individual. And then mediating a text is linked to all what we know about reformulating, transcoding, alternating languaging, switching oral to written, changing genre, combining text, and all other modes. These were the categories that we chose, and as you can see, there's a fourth square, which are the mediation strategies, because the point is not just what, but how to mediate. And this was at least as important as the mediation itself, as the descriptors for mediation itself. So all these concept were, this new vision, was operationalized by the companion volume into calibrated and validated descriptors that you find in the companion volume in this form. So there's a kind of mind map that helps the teacher navigate this archipelago of mediation with, as you see, mediating a text, and each of the little square is the title of a scale, mediating concept, mediating communication, and mediating strategies that include different forms. And all of them all this mediation can happen within the one language or variety or register, but also, of course, across languages, varieties, and registers. And this also, both of them actually link mediation to plurilingualism as well. Here are the titles, because it was not very visible in my previous slide. This was just to give you an idea of how they are organized. But here you have all the titles of the different scales. And as you can see, some of the aspects that we discussed before, like facilitating pluricultural space or acting as an intermediary, come into play in, for example, mediating communication. Mediating a text, as I said, is a more pedagogical one. Concepts, facilitating collaborative interaction with peer, collaborating to construct meaning, and finally the strategies like linking to previous knowledge or adapting the language. And as we said, we had these other three aspects. Well, each of them, across languages and cultures, across media, and across word, gave rise to, originated other scales with plurilingual and pluricultural competence and online interaction and literature. Of course, not just the plurilingual pluricultural competence go across languages and cultures, as you've seen, the others as well. So the idea was to move from a linear vision where communication is seen as linear and monolingual, and you learn to communicate a message and in the class in order to apply later to the life, to a more complex vision with both communication and language learning are complex, because you learn to construct and co-construct content, communication, linguistic and cultural repertoires, and the class is a real social context. So basically, before the CFR 2001, we had our 4 skills of listening, reading, speaking, and writing, which are reception and production, speak and hear, with accuracy and fluency, and mobilizing linguistic resources. With the CFR, we already had the idea of mediation, social agent, and negotiating meaning in interaction, but it's only with the companion volume that we go a step further into co-construction of meaning, and you co-construct by mobilizing plurilingual and pluricultural competences, and therefore you had the complexity to accuracy and fluency. Let's see now mediation and plurilingualism, why this dynamic view is so linked to a plurilingual vision. As I said, there are scales for mediating across languages and cultures, building on plurilingual repertoire, plurilingual comprehension, and building on pluricultural. Well, I said in the contrary, pluricultural repertoire first and plurilingual now. Let's see a little bit of history. Well, the concept of plurilingualism was already introduced in 1996 in a second draft of the CFR, and in a more elaborated form in a study related to the CFR by Costa, Moore, and Zarat. It was developed already as a form of dynamic creative process of languaging across the boundaries of language variety and the methodology and the language policy aims. So it had these 3 visions already, these 3 components, let's say, although they were not yet completely expressed in terms of descriptors, but they were already there in the conceptualization. And in fact, just 2 quotes from the CFR 2001 is this idea of the existence of a complex or even composite competence on which the user may draw. And the aim is to develop a linguistic repertory or repertoire in which all linguistic abilities have a place. So the main difference that the CFR made or proposed was to differentiate, to really distinguish between multilingualism and plurilingualism. It's a functional distinction. I know that many colleagues use multilingualism with some adjectives to in reality talk about plurilingualism, but I still think that this functional distinction helps us a lot in the conceptualization of the dynamic view that is behind plurilingualism. So multilingualism is languages side by side at the societal level mainly, but not only, even at the individual, if we try and keep our languages all separate and we never translanguage. Whereas plurilingualism is a network. It's really based on the idea of a network with multiple connection, where the mother tongue or the mother tongues or languages, L1s, etc., are always present, and error is part of a process. There is a conscious journey of learning, because you never start a tabula rasa, but you start from something and some knowledge, and the plurilingualism in turn open doors to pluriculturalism. And in fact, on the left, you have this idea that L1, L2 are linked and embedded in different C1, C2, and mix of them, because as we know, there is no overlap, no complete superposition between cultures and languages. So these were the definition. The idea of the coexistence on one side, but a very composite and very rich definition of plurilingualism on the right, where you have this idea of movement from one language or dialect to the other, from understanding and comprehend and expressing in different languages, calling upon a number of languages, a common international store. Mediate was already there, although just between individuals with no common language, as I said, and bringing the whole of their linguistic equipment into play, including alternative form of expression, paralinguistic, and simplification. So a substantial difference. The idea that you value an even and dynamic profile through plurilingualism, and it's a changing competence where the learner uses resources, and they have different resources in one language and the other. But they have a single interconnected and interrelated repertoire that is in turn, if you remember the descriptive scheme, linked to the general competencies and the strategies that they use in order to accomplish tasks. So this uneven and plurilingual competence is always changing because your profiles of proficiency vary, and plus the pluricultural profile may vary, or usually vary, in comparison to the plurilingual profile. It's a very liberating, let's say, competence, because it's not the simple addition of monolingual competencies, but it allows all forms of mixing, meshing, switching, and translanguaging. It's a partial competence in the sense that every competence is functional, can be functional with respect to limited objective. It's definitely not compartmentalized, because a communicative competence is made of all knowledge and experience of the language. It's really made up of them, and languages interrelate and interact within this uneven plurilingual competence. And thus, finally, there is this idea of developing a linguistic repertoire in which all linguistic abilities have a place, and abandoning the perfect bilingualism. So, we move towards a dynamic and developing linguistic repertoire with this idea of cognitive economy, non-compartmentalization, and a general language education. Here you have some examples of descriptors of mediation. As you can see, even they go from language B to language A, because the idea of L1, or even worse, mother tongue, is kind of overcome now, because we can have different configuration, facilitating communication in delicate situation. This is a level B1. And these are descriptors of plurilingual at the level A2. So as you can see, you can mobilize your limited repertoire in order to explain a problem, to ask for help, recognize that your behavior may convey a message different to the one it is intended. So you see that between plurilingualism and mediation, there's really a lot of synergies. Here you have some comments from the piloting phase. What we saw among the teachers who piloted these descriptors was this awareness raising process and confidence boost that those descriptors, that making this aspect visible, provided, awareness regarding the importance of plurilingualism, and the idea and the awareness also of the gap that we still have even at university in considering plurilingualism. But also in general for mediation, they were more aware, students, of how language can be used to collaborate, take turns, build a conversation, work towards a goal, and building upon each other's ideas. So basically, the new pluriscales revealed the dynamic nature of plurilingualism and supported plurilanguaging, which can be considered a dynamic and never-ending process to make meaning using different linguistic and semiotic resources, where there is a cyclical process of exploring, constructing in the language, an agentic process where the social agent selects and self-organizes, and doing that, there is an enhanced perception of the language and the learning process as well. And it's an empowering process also in relation to the norm. The norm is no longer seen as a strict straitjacket, but it's something you deal with and you are using with agency towards a scope. So we get to the end of our talk with this idea that all this work on mediation made the invisible visible. Basically helped us to see that language use is the tip of the iceberg, but language can be considered as an emergent phenomenon. Behind and below this emergent phenomenon, which is at the border of my iceberg, there is all that we have explained that informs of that. So the idea that language is socialization into community of practice, made of social experiences of agency from the social agent, that is able to perceive affordances, even to looking for them, and together or alone and together, I would say, construct and co-construct a meaning, and develops linguistic and cultural trajectories through languaging and plurilanguaging. So mediation can really be seen as a Copernican revolution in language education, and not only in language education, but in education tout court. Mediation is at the core of knowledge construction, co-construction, reconstruction, done, as we said, both individually and socially, and breaks down the walls of Cartesian thinking that separates the individual from culture and society. So it has a great potential for language education, because we saw that already in the first data, and we are collecting new ones, that it makes learners and teachers aware of the mediated and complex nature of language and of language learning, facilitates social integration, and empowers learners by recognizing that they have their own trajectories and funds of knowledge. And so they want to develop them, no longer to hide them. Finally, it broadens the scope, as I said, of language education and of education in general terms. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.